So, as mentioned, today we celebrate the feast of Saint Luke. Luke was he was not an apostle, one of the 12. Okay, so you had the 12, and then you have the 72. I think that's one of the reasons why their gospel is chosen today, because it highlights the 72. Luke most likely was in the midst of that 72, but of course he was he was a physician, and he was the gospel writer. He also wrote the gospel, or he also wrote the Acts of the Apostles. We know that he was very close friends with Paul. So the Gospel of Luke a lot of times is called really, or known as Paul's Gospel, because the movie Paul that Jim Caviezel played really showed how Paul's in prison there, and Luke would sneak in and visit Paul as he's in prison, about waiting, ready to be killed, and Paul would be recounting to Luke all of his his experiences, and Luke penning this, and of course the Acts of the Apostles. But they were close friends, and that movie brought that off as well. And in Colossians, and one of Paul's letters in Colossians chapter 4, he says, "My dear friend Luke, the physician, and Demas," who we also hear in our first reading today from St. Paul to Timothy. And so this second letter to Timothy is the last letter that Paul writes. He's in prison right before he gets killed in Rome. His very last letter. And what is Paul doing? He's saying, Timothy, who he loved as a son, and he's writing these two letters, he says, Timothy, get Mark and come here. You come, bring Mark with you. Luke is already here. He's the only one that hasn't abandoned me, who I did call Demas my friend. He has left me. Luke is the only one with me, he says. So get Mark and come here. What's Paul doing? He's at the very end of his life. He wants to bring his friends together, because he so desperately wants to make sure that the gospel message continues to get passed on. He wants to let's get close, let's get tight here, really important. Let's make sure that this gets passed on to the next generation. I think, Paul in prison there and gathering his friends, and even the amount of work that it must have taken for, Timothy to grab Mark and to bring him. And I think of how, Bishop Conlon, a number of years ago when I was in seminary, he told us, he was pointing to a study that showed that it's really for the first time in Christianity that the faith is beginning to not get passed on from one generation to the next. And I forget the study that he cited and, how he backed that up. But, I think we can see that. Because it used to be, even, when someone has a child, they would get their child baptized, even if they had fallen away, or getting married in the church. That's beginning to get less and less. The faith is beginning to not get passed on to the generation to the next. And, so for all of us, for parents, for grandparents, for godparents, like, do we see that? Like Paul gathering, he's on his deathbed, or his death cell, I guess. And he's gathering his friends in. Like, I want to make sure this gets passed on. Not just because he's been commissioned to do it, but because he knows that this is liberating news. It's good news. It's life-changing news. It brings about abundant life. Do we see that as our most important marching orders towards our kids and grandkids now? Too, we know, like, parents and grandparents can do everything, but that's why the pain is so there when one's child rejects it. But I just think hearing Paul here, the friendship, his desire here for Luke. And then maybe just the close here, we see also, we can think Paul is just this great evangelist, probably the greatest evangelist ever lived. And we see him as kind of like this tough guy, this heart of steel. But what we see here is Paul's got a heart of flesh like anybody else. And his heart, because it's a heart of flesh, it can be wounded. And he's abandoned by his closest friends. He's by everybody. And because he's got a hard job, and parents and grandparents, and we live in a post-Christian world, means we have a hard job. We need that encouragement. We need that help. We need those around us. Paul feels abandoned. At my defense, no one appeared on my behalf, he says. Everyone deserted me. But the Lord stood by me and gave me strength. When we feel abandoned, when we feel as if things have gone from bad to worse, or even maybe our friends and things are going poorly, my goodness, how helpful is this to be like Paul here, for us to remember to say, the Lord stands by me. And he gives me strength. He gave me strength in the past. Even though I'm deserted here by many of those around me, he remains with me. And for us to be like Luke too, to be faithful, to be a faithful friend. And so let us, as we turn to the Eucharist here, let us have our hearts increase with the desire and the importance to pass on the faith as Luke the evangelist did so well.